Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Okay, Count Corla. This is again an amendment which I think is of huge importance to the people of this country, and frankly I think is a scandal that is on a par with the Apple 13 billion, is directly related indeed, should I say, to the scandal of the Apple 13 billion, but turns what is already an enormous scandal around that 13 billion of tax that Apple should have paid but didn't pay, and which the government still doesn't want to collect. But now we discover, courtesy of the Paradise Papers, so-called, that in fact the double Irish tax scam, which our tax code facilitated to the tune of 13 billion in lost taxes to the people of this country, that the real figure of losses may be far, far bigger than that, because when the phasing out of the double Irish was indicated from the end of 2013 onwards that it was likely to happen because of political pressure in this House, primarily from the left, from ourselves and Sinn Féin, externally from people raging about tax avoidance by multinationals, and an international, growing international opprobrium about the scams of these multinationals, robbing ordinary people of billions in tax revenue that could have been going into housing, health and education, particularly at a time of austerity. What we discover is the so-called closing of the double Irish tax scam was simply a prelude to the opening of another tax scam to benefit Apple and a few other extraordinarily wealthy corporations. And I think the narrative on this, the chronology, is well worth setting out. I remember in July 2013, when myself, Joe Higgins, Pearse Doherty and so on were the only ones who wanted Apple brought in, and Facebook and Google, to the Finance Committee Subcommittee on Global Taxation. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour, some independents who were on that committee closed ranks and said, no, we're not bringing them in to ask questions about the double Irish. Not only that, they incredibly turned off the cameras where we were discussing it. There was an unprecedented decision to have it in camera, in private session, when we would discuss whether or not they should come in and when a vote would be taken on whether they should come in. This was the degree of servility of the entire political establishment in the face of Apple when the rumours about the scale of the double Irish were abounding and were being articulated by some of us in the committee. Roll the clock on and it all becomes clear just the scale of the double Irish tax scam, and that likelihood, as the government are forced into saying they will close it down, Enda Kenny scurries over to a private meeting with the CEO of Apple in January of 2014, where he admitted on the record, when questioned by us after that meeting, corporation tax was discussed. I'd love to see the minutes of those meetings or the recordings of those meetings as to what was discussed. But what we do know now, thanks to the Paradise Papers, is that lawyers acting on behalf of Apple in March, shortly after that meeting, start to contact the Appleby firm, who specialise in tax avoidance for big corporations, and contacted their subsidiaries in March 2014 in the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, the Isle of Man, Guernsey and Jersey, all tax havens where there's no corporate tax. Apple settled on Jersey. Contacting the Appleby, the firm acting on behalf of Apple asked, can you confirm that an Irish company can conduct management activities without being subject to taxation in your jurisdiction? So there they were. Apple were busy reconfiguring the tax scam using their Irish companies because of the possibility of the double Irish being closed down. Richard Bruton went over and met Apple later in the year. And indeed, we had a debate at the Budget 214 committee where I suggested, to much ridicule from the government, I suggested the following. The much-trumpeted double Irish will in fact be replaced by another scheme through which the same companies will be able to avoid pretty much the same amount of taxes, but in a slightly different way, by speaking about patents and intellectual property rights. Jesus, I didn't know how right I was. The scam was already being planned. The replacement of the double Irish was already being engineered by the government and Apple. How else can you explain the extraordinary coincidence that Apple do not pay a single extra cent of tax after the closing of the double Irish and the reconfiguration of their subsidiaries to Jersey and the interaction of them allowing them to pay no tax? Something that is confirmed by Seamus Coffey. According to Seamus Coffey, the raising to the 100% cap on intangible assets meant that, he says, we lost 722 million in tax revenue in the year 2015. He goes on to say that the changes you brought in the recent budget, because they are only active going forward from the day of the budget, he says, had they, and they could have, he points out, applied to all claims during the period when you had raised the allowance to 100%, he says, would have resulted in, I quote, up to 1 billion of additional corporation tax being collected in 2018. So this isn't just history. 1 billion you decide not to take from Apple for next year's budget. Now imagine what that would do for the housing crisis, for the health crisis and for the lives of people who are chronically under-resourced in areas of key public services.
Thank you, Deputy